Part of the problem of discussing the kind of issues that the whole grand conference session is that you always have to make sure that you read the newspaper before you come for any session, and which means that I have all of these stacks of newspaper clippings and things like that that I want to use to illustrate some points. But let me make sure that I have my watch here so that I don't talk too long, so that we can have a time to have discussion. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for long conversations, and Abu Bakr and Jamal. The introductory comments already show the problem that I hope you all will have, and that is that whatever you thought you were going to say before you came to any of the meetings, whatever you thought you were going to hear before you came to any of the sessions, will change as the sessions go on. And I simply can't help, I can't resist starting the keynote for Islamic reform movements since Arab Spring with an observation about the quickie conversation that we just had about Luray Caverns. Created by nature, created by God. And there was already some, this and this. That argument is 150 years old. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan in India said, Islam is nature, and nature is Islam. And Jamaluddin al-Afghani said, naturism is heresy and atheism. The debates that we look at, the lines of thought that we have in dealing with the movements of religious reform, and I'm going to expand it a little bit, not just sort of looking at Islamic reform, the religious reform, these debates have in-depth continuities throughout the modern era. And so that the question that we have as we look at these kind of continuities, as we're reminded of the continuities with Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and Jamaluddin al-Afghani debating in the 1880s, does it make any difference that we've had the Arab Spring? Does it make any difference that we've had all of these events in the last 150 years? Or are we still in some kind of tired ways talking about things that have been better said? In intra-Christian dialogue, I very often sort of back off. You get the literalist fundamentalist debate with the liberal modernists and so on, and you get to creationism, and you get all of these sort of debates, whichever side you're on. As you listen to them, as I listen to them, I say, I've heard all of this before, and if I want a really good defense of creationism, I haven't heard anything better than William Jennings Bryan in the 1920s. And if I want a good defense of evolutionism, I've got Clarence Darrow in the 1920s. And they said it a lot better than most people are doing those kind of debates in 2013. And so the question is, are we, as we're looking at religious reform movements, are we simply looking at rehashes? Or are we looking at something that may be moving forward or at least different? I would like to suggest that part of the new thing, part of our new context, is in terms of the vocabulary and so on. I'll see if I can't find, I've got a couple of illustrative pictures here. Some of you may have seen a book ad for this book. I don't care about the content at the moment. I want to just look at the cover and the title. Now, Jack, will the two of you make sure I don't blind you? But if you look there, if you look at that title, That is something with its A in the little circle that we all pretty much know sort of what the reference is. It's the internet. It's all of this sort of electronic world that we're living in, and so on. This is part of our current literacy. Now, quite frankly, for most of the students, that's something you learned when you were really young. But for people like Abdulaziz and me, 20 years, how long ago, at what point did that start becoming intelligible? 20 years ago, that would have been absolutely meaningless to me. I wouldn't have known what in heaven's name that was talking, or what in earth's name that was talking about. I look at our current headlines. For modern politics. 140 characters say a lot about modern politics. Subheadline, campaigns increasingly use Twitter for immediate feedback to shape their messages. # 2012 election. This comes from last year in the Washington Post. Now, I think most of us in the room understand what that article is about. But again, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago if you're talking Twitter, I mean, Twitter was what Tweety did when he saw the big bad cat. That's incomprehensible. Or some of the really interesting spy and intelligence and security things. Again, from the Washington Post a little while ago. Al-Qaeda internet forums go dark. Unclear if cyber attack caused sustained outage of groups' main sites. Now, Abdulaziz talked about the cyberspace and so on. That simply wasn't even part of our vocabulary, let alone part of what we did 10 or 15 years ago. And so we are in some kind of a new era. And I think that we need to be aware of this kind of new era. And there I will, again, changing our example a little bit because of what has already been said. When Abdulaziz closed his comments, he said that he and I had been talking for a long time. We had. And I think Abdulaziz and I think you and I had conversations before IIIT was formed in the early 1980s. And one of the really joyful times that I remember, usually you're at a conference and you have lots of people and so on, but you and I spent a week in Qum and got to sit in the hotel and talk by ourselves. This is, I think, it reflects what I think of as part of the challenge of religious reform movements in the 21st century. When Abdulaziz and I were sitting in a hotel room or sitting in a hotel lobby in Qum, gosh, it was 1998, a long time ago, when we were sitting there and talking, he and I were not having an interfaith dialogue. He and I were not having a mutual tolerance for coexistence. He and I were talking to each other because we had shared interests. And as I looked at that IIIT film, and I was sitting there, most of the people, I won't say everybody who said something there, but most of the people who were in that film observing and commenting on the mission of IIIT are people with whom I have a greater degree of agreement on fundamental religious moral values than I have with many of my, quote, Christian co-believers. And so some of you have heard me say this before, but as I look at the work of the Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, I like to say one of my goals in that work is to bring an end to interreligious dialogue. That is, interreligious dialogue assumes that you're different from me in such a profound way that we have to invent a way for us to talk. And what I want us to do is to be able to have a sense, and it's a challenge for reform, to have the sense of transforming our globalized electronic world from a world of separate groupings that then have to arrange for dialogue, transforming that into groups of people who have shared values that can be in conversation, not just sort of formally in dialogue. Now, as we look then at our particular world, I'll go back to our Arab Spring now. As I was thinking about Islamic reform after Arab Spring, I started thinking, I suspect, and this may be even true for Jamal, and I know it's true for Abdulaziz, I suspect I was a graduate student before anybody else in the room. Maybe not quite, but I first went, I already had my master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies when I first went to Egypt in 1960. I was a graduate student already. I mean, ancient, and I went to the Pharaonic Studies Institute in Heliopolis or something like that. But we need to ask, from that kind of perspective, I think it's useful to ask the question, which Arab Spring are we talking about? Because when I was a graduate student, and when I was an undergraduate in the mid-50s, there was also something that people approached with the same rhetoric that we do now with the Arab Spring. That is, there was this great revolution in Cairo in 1952 that set a wave of overthrowing authoritarian, evil, exploitative, suppressive regimes. And that you had then the revolution in Cairo in 52. You had the Iraqi Revolution. You had the transformation. You had the United Arab Republic for 3 years. You had the revolution in Yemen. You had all of these things, and this was a time then of great turmoil and of expectation. The old regime was being thrown out. The old exploitative, repressive regimes were being thrown out by the idealistic young new generation. And I think it's useful to study ancient history for a minute and just to think about Islamic reform at that time. That Islamic reform at that time was embedded in all of the concepts of what people now talk about as modernization theory and the failed secularization theory. In that 1960-61 period, I had the opportunity to simply hitchhike around wherever I wanted to. It was, those were the days when you had a certain amount of freedom of movement. And I ended up in Tunis during Ramadan in that year, and that was the year after Habib Bourguiba, as a, quote, Islamic reformer, had announced that people should not participate in Ramadan, they should not fast because they were involved in the jihad of development. And in 1960, the Islamic ideas of secularism in Turkey, who was the ideal who was going to transform, who were the ideal leaders who were going to transform society? People always mentioned Mustafa Kemal. Why can't we follow the Turkish example? Interesting sort of reflection on our current. Or you looked at a variety of other places in 1960, 61, in the early 60s, Islamic reform that was visible and revolutionary was participating essentially in the secularization of society. I did what graduate students do in Cairo in 60, 61, and then in 62, 63. Sat around and had coffee, ate ice cream and gropies. If you ever do research in Cairo, I think you can still get ice cream sundaes at gropies. What? Oh, they don't give you sundaes anymore? Okay, yeah, well, we used to get gooey sundaes. But, there was an expectation then that there would be some role for Islam, but it would be only as it would be embedded in the so-called radical ideology of the new younger generation. And so the net result of reform in the 1960s was you had revolutionary graduate students studying with people like Ali Shariati, who were moving toward a new vision of society. If you were lucky, you got Ali Shariati. If you were not so lucky, you got some of the other more fanatic revolutionary changers. But Islamic reform in the 60s and in the 70s was primarily either trying to figure out how you could be secular as a part of the radical revolutionaries, or how you could be a fundamentalist revolutionary responder. But things have changed. Things have changed. As we look at contemporary Islamic movements, as we look at contemporary Islamic reformers, post-Arab Spring, we have some examples with the new political regimes in the Arab world. As we look at the results of the Arab Spring, commentators tend to identify one of the, quote, facts of the Arab Spring, that the Arab Spring overthrew authoritarian regimes and opened the way for Islamically oriented organizations to come forward. And so you have Muslim Brotherhood Party in Egypt, you have Nahda in Tunisia, you have the relative success of the Justice and Development Party in Morocco, you have the long-standing success of the Justice and Development Party, AKP, in Turkey, and so on. So, as we look at this scene, let me shift to being very kind of broad for a moment. There is a transformation. There are a couple of transformations that have taken place since the 1960s that we need to, I think, be aware of. One of my favorite contrasting set of quotes is to look at what informed globally visionary people were thinking about religion. Now, Arnold Toynbee, the famous world historian, who gave great strength to, who saw great strength for religion in his grand theory of world history, by the middle of the 1960s, wrote a foreword to a book called Religion in Secular Society. And he could assert in that foreword, without really much fear of contradiction at all, except from Andrew Greeley. Some of you may recognize Andrew Greeley as a name of the Jesuit who just died, who was a strong critic of religious analysis. But Arnold Toynbee could assert without much fear of contradiction in the mid-1960s, quote, "All current religions, whether tribe-bound or missionary or lower or higher, have been losing their hold on the hearts and consciences and minds of their former adherents. Sociologists of religion were writing essays on religionless societies. What would be the nature of religionless societies? Sociologists of religion were talking about the inevitability of the secularization of society, which meant in the 1960s vocabulary that religion was no longer going to be anything other than a matter of private individual faith. 4 decades later, in the not terribly idealistic journal Foreign Affairs, not known necessarily for its strong advocacy of religious moral values, good analysis quite often, but 4 decades after Toynbee wrote sort of the epitaph for religion, Scott Taylor, in an article in Foreign Affairs, began that article with the assertion, again, without much expectation that he was going to be contradicted, quote, "Around the world, from the southern United States to the Middle East, religion is on the rise. The major world religions are all taking advantage of the opportunities provided by globalization to transform their messages and reach a new global audience." The big difference between Islamic reform in 1960 and Islamic reform in 2013 is that in 1960 even the reformers tended to have this sense that the old mode of religion was on the way out, and secular society was coming forward and we had to cope with it. In 2013, people are aware that this is a new day, and a new day for religion. Now, we must be careful as we look at this transformation not to assume that what Toynbee was talking about as religions and what Scott Taylor was talking about as religions are exactly the same thing, because there are differences, and I will talk about some of those differences in a moment. But I want to get to the second transformation, and that is, in the 1960s, people were talking about movements and movement organizations, and you had the reform movements, you had the radical movements of radical socialism and so on. And they fit into a pattern of the great social movements of the time. The Nasserite Revolution, or Sukarno in Indonesia, or Sekou Touré in Guinea. These are people who were coming to the fore at the same time as you have major ideological value-laden movements in the United States and elsewhere, same time as the civil rights movement, same time as a whole series of other movements. And they fit into a broad pattern that gets studied in contemporary scholarship within the framework of what people call social movement theory. Now, social movement theory talks about asks the question, how do movements express themselves in order to mobilize people? And we start I want us to start with Tahrir. We've seen this kind of a picture. This was a very common picture back in the days of Tahrir. Notice that it's filled with tents. Notice that it is an established control of space. It is the prototypical, what we now use, the terminology now is the, quote, the Occupy movement. Now, great social movements that try to present a revolutionary program or a program of transformation have changed in terms of how they go about it. In the 19th century, especially in Europe, in continental Europe, you had a special revolutionary mode. You had certain kinds of things that you had to do. So that, for example, in the revolution of 1848. The cry was, "To the barricades!" You know, and every revolution, every respectable revolution, even if you didn't need to have barricades, every respectable revolution had to have barricades. And so you could cry, "To the barricades." And it reflects a certain mode of mobilization of people. Now, quite frankly, this is a Vernet's portrait of the barricades of Paris in 1848. As you look at it, or as you say, remember, I suspect some of you at least have seen one version or another of Les Miserables. There weren't any tents out in the street. People went to the barricades and they defended the barricades, but often they went home at night. You know, that this was not an Occupy movement, this was a demonstration using barricades. Now, you have a similar kind of mode of, the expansion mode is the march to present a petition, the march to present to the ruler, or the march to present a message. And this is the 1963 Civil Rights March, the famous event where Martin Luther King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. Now again, look at this. This is a demonstration. Thousands and thousands of people came out in the morning. They went to the street. They marched about. And then, when they said amen at the benediction, everybody went home. Look carefully. There isn't a single tent there. Now, there probably were tents of people selling hot dogs, but they were off to the side. They were not part of the demonstration. And so what you have then is this kind of mode, which, just as I said, in the 19th century, no respectable revolution didn't have the cry to the barricades. Well, these days, most movements of protest will have a march. I don't think there is a single cause that I can think of in United States politics that hasn't at one point or another had a march on Washington. You know, that whatever your cause, it's a march on Washington. Now, going back for a minute. Going back for a minute, then what this represents a new kind of thing. This represents a new mode of operation. Rather than just simply moving forward through the streets to present a program, what you have is a mode of occupation that takes control over space. Now, there's a lovely picture even now for the tent city kind of thing. Nowadays, most respectable opposition demonstrations will be Occupy movements rather than demonstration and march through the streets movements. One of my favorite little pictures is you had an Arab Spring reflection in Socotra. And Socotra didn't have a big thousands of people, didn't have lots of thousands of people to demonstrate anyway. But in the capital, in the marketplace, they had their demonstration. And what did they do? They put up a tent. Now, as it worked out, they put up the tent, and then everybody went home at night, and then they came back to the tent each day. But no respectable occupation demonstration doesn't have a tent. And so 2 days ago, as we look at Taksim and the Turkish, there's an article, "Turkish capital heats up as protests subside in Istanbul." In the lead paragraph, in a park here today, by day, demonstrators occupied an island of bedrolls and blankets. In the evening, residents banged kitchen pots to sound a persistent note of dissent. Around midnight in Turkey's normally staid capital, riot police officers beat back chanting protesters. An island of bedrolls, blankets, and tents. Occupation, an occupation of space. Now, what you have then is the kind of question, what does this tell us about movements? Movements are changing in their mode of expression. And as we think about social movements, as we think about Islamic reform movements, I think in the 1960s we can make generic kind of comments about and observations about what were the nature of the movements that were involved and so on, and they fit into the pattern of social movement theory. Now, one of the major scholars for developing social movement theory he recently died, a scholar by the name of Charles Tilly. And he wrote a very helpful book called Social Movements, 1768 to 2012. This is a story of how social movements developed as modes of expression of opinion, of opposition, or expression of advocacy, and for mobilization. And he developed and social movement theory develops a very solid sort of sense of you have mobs, and they're not movements, they're mobs. You have city crowds, they're not movements, they're city crowds. You have a whole variety of formats, and then you have social movements that have to have a kind of permanency, that have to have a relatively predictable mode of expression, and so on. And Tilly and other people in social movement theory argue that the social movement format, with its repertoire of protests, whether it was a street demonstration or an Occupy or a barricade, that social movements are basically a modern style phenomenon interacting with and making use of the resources of modern technology and modern society. However, Tilly looked then at social movements of the 21st century, or what might be called social movements of the 21st century. And in this grand survey, in his final sort of chapter, The Futures of Social Movements, he says, the social movement as an invented institution, it's something that people developed as a mechanism for influencing society. The social movement as an invented institution could disappear or mutate into some quite different form of politics. We still have no guarantee that the social movement as it has prevailed for 2 centuries will continue forever. We must take seriously the possibility that the 21st century will destroy social movements as vehicles of popular claim-making because the conditions for their survival have dissolved or because new forms of claim-making have supplanted them. And I think that as we look at Islamic reform movements, as we look at Islamic organizations, I think we can see in those reform movements, and it's useful to try and look for them, we can see in those movements the impact of the social and technological changes that the 21st century has brought. And so that, the mechanism of the flash dance. Everybody know what a flash dance is? A flash mob, flash dance? The mechanism of a flash mob is possible now in a way that it never was possible before. That you can mobilize people without security forces knowing. You can have an instantaneous demonstration that appears out of nowhere and disappears into nowhere very quickly. And that's very different from a flash mob is very different from what we're looking at here. It represents a new mode. And I think that as we look at Islamic organizations, as we look at Islamic reform movements, we can see the beginning of their taking advantage of the new modes of communication and so on. I will just, my instructions are to talk for about 45 minutes, and I see I have about five minutes or so left. And what I just want to do is say, okay, in this context, we've had in the last month and a half 3 elections. that illustrate what I wanted, what the title talks about of what I said I would talk about, and that is pop politics. In the, quote, Arab Spring of the 1950s, popular participation in politics was something that was managed by a small group of people. I can remember participating in a demonstration of support for Gamal Abdel Nasser when he came home from the United Nations. It was fun. It was great excitement. You had people surging up and down the streets and so on. But what you had was it was all very well organized. My favorite image in that is the dual image. As people came in, you had government trucks with posters that were handed out. You know, a nice poster on a stick, on a piece of wood, and so on, that were handed out to all of the people. And so it made a very nice event. But then at the end, as where I was, the people then, after the demonstration was over, people started trying to collect the posters. Now, good wood in Egypt is expensive. And so there were these two old guys who had these marvelous good wood sticks, and they got into a big fight with the government people because you gave this to me. This is my stick. You can't. That's right. You know. But that kind of mobilization was an elite top-down mobilization, and what religious movements are learning to do is to mobilize more effectively from the bottom up. And this has resulted then in transformations. As we look at the elections in Malaysia, one of the things that I think is an interesting feature of the Malaysian thing is to look at the, quote, the person that I remember in the early 1980s, after the Iranian Revolution, they were looking at Malaysia, a young hotshot, and they say, is this the Southeast Asian Khomeini? Now, this is Anwar. Now, if you look at that picture, this is him now in the election. He was the organizer of the Muslim youth organization that was in the 1970s and in the 1980s a major reform movement for rethinking Islam in politics. This is, in the Malaysian election, this is the opposition. And what you've got is three political parties there that have a shared program. You've got Anwar and his Keadilan party, his Justice Party. You have Lim, the Chinese Democratic Party, and Abdul Hadi Awang from the PAS party. Now, the really interesting feature for our purposes of the transformation of Islamic reform movements is the position of Hadi Awang. PAS started in the 1950s as a classic Islamic party advocating implementation of Sharia, an Islamic constitution. It stuck to a very conservative political vision of what an Islamic society, an Islamic state should be, advocating an Islamic state. And from 1954 on to the 1980s and then into up to 1999, PAS maintained that sort of purist position of old-fashioned interpretation of law and society, and in a very substantial, large parliament, never got into the double digits. 6, 7, 8 members. It did win control of a couple of conservative provinces and so on. 1999, it joined with the supporters of Anwar. It joined with the DAP. It joined with the Chinese party. And to do that, it had to pull back from its Islamist, old-fashioned conceptualization to being open to coexistence, to being open to dialogue, and to modifying its version. In the current election, the PAS itself, as a part of the coalition, for the third major election, has double-digit numbers in members of the parliament. It lost 2 seats, but it is still in the 20s in terms of its seats. And as you look at what's happening, what you see is a transition from the old line of battling against old-fashioned secularism of the 1950s and 60s into the revisioning of the political program of the 21st century. This transformation has happened in a number of parties. You look at the Islamist tradition in politics in Turkey, the old party, Fazilat, and Erbakan, and so on, as compared to the AKP. The old Erbakan party was a good old-fashioned Islamic constitution party in many ways, which is why it always got made illegal. But you have this kind of transformation. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, for a number of elections, Islam is the solution, was its slogan. In the current electoral cycle, Islam is the solution disappeared from. Now, whether or not it disappeared from the minds of the Brotherhood is different from the program, but it disappeared from the program. And it was Nahda. It was the Renaissance of Egypt as the slogan. And so what we have, I think, is this kind of illustration. However, in terms of what these elections show us about contemporary politics, there's another little headline that I just want to share. On the day before the Iranian election, on June 13th, the Washington Post had an article on the election, and the headline is, "Iran Election Shows Waning Clout of Clerics. Divided Theocratic Order Reveals Few Signs of Past Political Influence." And so, let's look at who won the presidential election, the declining role of the clerics. The only cleric who remained on the presidential ballot is the person who won the election. And he won more than 50% of the vote in the first time around. Now, that is a reminder that the old style of understanding Islamic reform doesn't fit the contemporary circumstances. The old style, whether it's my lay Turkish friends who are secularists or the Washington Post, see the old style of Islamic thought as being identified with the clerics, and the new style as being associated with something else. But as we look at the history of Iranian elections, the people who have won as reformers have been clerics. Khatami, Rafsanjani. And so this should tell us again that by the time we reach the 21st century, the role of people with turbans is a new and a different role as well. Well, it's time for me to stop. Let me just say that I think that we're looking at a new kind of world of Islamic reform, new kind of Islamic world of reform in which old secularization and old Islamic reform is being transformed into new modes of expression that we're still in the process of trying to define what's going on. Thank you very much. In the 21st century, we do have really important Islamic figures who are women who are part of transformation of Islamic movements. And I had her father, but this is Nur Aliza, which represents, I think, in many ways, the new politics, the activist young woman. I would urge you to look at YouTube, search for Nur Aliza, and watch her at a political rally. I mean, hello, she's better than her father in a political rally in terms of being able to do things. Also, out of Malaysia, you have the Sisters in Islam, that represents a major kind of force. And along with sisters, I would mention Karama here. And then, of course, our Nobel Prize winner, um, uh, Mutawakkil Carmen. I think that this is a dimension, the dimension of women's proactive involvement in the movement is something that is very different, as you say, from 1960, for example. Um, and then just from Abdulaziz's comments, there is one thing that maybe we would disagree um, on how I would use what he said. And that is, he said that what we really need to deal with is, can religion create a universal language? And that, I think, is important. But maybe I'll stretch it and say, you're not saying, or I wouldn't say, ask the question, can religion create a universal creedal doctrine? Instead, what we need is the language so that we can understand each other as we search for common solutions. Now, Brother Mahmoud, it's always a pleasure. And I think the context becomes very important. And in particular, the two where he started, like the contexts of Nasser and Bourguiba. Um, when I came away from those early days, um, it was an interesting experience where you could feel the same thing but different. Tunisia is different from Egypt. I think the contextualization of all of the movements becomes an important thing. Anwar Ibrahim is different from Ghanouchi. He's different from Hassan Tarabi. They are all different, but they all represent a part of the longer term efforts to interpret and to understand Islam. Um, I would like to say, yes, maybe you're being controversial, but I agree with you. That I do think that we have, and let me shift the terminology. The nomenclatura, we're all of the quote specialists tend to be academics. And I would say that we are also stuck with the nomenclatura of the academic, and that part of the Islamic reform movement involves escaping from that nomenclatura as well. But I would want to expand a little bit your comment that as I look at Egypt, for example, I don't think it's just Morsi that doesn't have a clue as to what might be going on. Neither does Amr Musa. Neither does Baradei. And so that the question is not, can we get rid of these Islamists in order to have some realistic secularists? It's rather trying to get to a point where the people who are engaged in the old debates can to some extent forget the old debates and recognize the problems that you're mentioning. But the blindness to the current problems is not limited to Nahda in Tunisia. It's part of the whole problem of we don't even have the vocabulary, as Abdulaziz said. We don't even have the political vocabulary to understand what's going on these days. With Loe, thank you for your kind comments. I would have a reservation in terms of the Islam and the West, as you expressed it there, in the sense of these being the polarities. I quite frankly do not think that the polarity of tension or that the sides in the debate are defined by Islam on the one side and the West on the other. IIIT here in the United States and your own activities show us that the debate is not between the West as an essentialized entity and Islam as an essentialized or reified entity. The debates in the plural are in shaping commonalities and in identifying differences. And the big differences are not necessarily, and the big commonalities are not necessarily defined by the polarity of Islam and the West. Yeah, well, that's what. Mm-hmm. Use your mic.
Ataturk. But Ataturk represented Western modernity voice within the Muslim world that required a response. And that's where I'm talking about. I'm talking about the West as a political entity vis-a-vis Muslim countries, but the West as a Western modernity versus traditional Islam and the debate within the Muslim world about it.
Yeah, and I think though, as we look at modernity itself is another one of those contextual, the contextual kinds of things. That modernity, in the old debate between Jamaluddin al-Afghani and Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, modernity was a particular format for expressing theological and natural and scientific positions that was tied very closely to the West. In the debates in the 21st century, you have a modernity, you have multiple modernities that have different modes of expression, and I think it is that more flexible thing that you were just saying.